Thank you very much, firstly, for joining us. Aware there's a huge amount of content out there at the moment regarding the SBTi version 2 net zero standard. So we hope today you'll find it a practical session. We're really aiming to, reduce the jargon, focus in on a couple of key areas, and hopefully provide a valuable session for you. So, if you could just go to the next slide, I'll talk you through what we are and aren't planning to do today. So, the purpose here is really to help you understand the practical implications of the standard, what it will mean for you as a business. What it isn't trying to do is go through a very detailed criteria by criteria review. We definitely need more than 1 hour for that. And secondly, we're not introducing you to the SBTi basics. We're assuming a decent level of basic understanding of the SBTi as a framework. We're going to focus then on the key themes and changes from version 1 and really try to distill what we see as mattering most. And we will have a Q&A at the end, but also wanted to flag we're going to have a poll, which is asking your views on what our follow-up topics should be. So if there's a particular area you'd like us to do a more in-depth session on, or perhaps create some more resources about, please do let us know. The slides and recording will be shared with those of you who registered after the webinar and be available on our website. So what we're actually going to cover, it's in 3 sections. The first is
Olwen,
yeah.
just there's a comment here that there's a bit of feedback on the audio apparently for participants. I'm not sure if
Okay.
perhaps once you hand over to Rich, you can have a look at putting some headphones in, something like that.
Apologies for that. Sorry to hear. I'll race through these. Let me know if it's causing more difficulties. Otherwise, I'll just speak slowly and audio is fine. Okay, others have said it's fine.
Yeah, I
Okay,
hear you fine as well. So hopefully
great.
that's just a
Hopefully it's just
isolated problem.
Yeah, perfect. So, we'll kick off with the background. Rich is going to go through some high-level summaries of the updates, just, what's the main major changes we've seen since the previous version. And then we're going to spend the majority of the session doing topical deep dives. So we've selected 3 areas that we think are really the most interesting and have the most significant updates to dive into here. So Rich will go through the new Scope 3 target setting approaches available, what that could look like for you as a company. I'll then talk about what I think is a very interesting new concept, the implementation hierarchy, and then hand things over to Emilien to go through the ongoing emissions responsibility framework. And then we'll wrap up with just a few slides on, in practice, what might this mean for you, both in terms of next steps of actually going through the target setting process or updating existing targets, but also, what should you be doing from an action perspective now and an internal governance and planning perspective. We will have Q&A at the end. We're aiming for about 15 minutes of it, so please do ask your questions through the Q&A function. We might get back to a few as we go. If not, we'll facilitate a discussion at the end. Great. So before we dive in, just a couple of slides to introduce 3Kill and those of us on the line today. If you're not as familiar with 3Kill, we are a sustainability consultancy. We're based in the UK, but we operate globally. And we focus primarily, but not exclusively, on FMCG and natural resource supply chains. We became part of FARA, an applied science leader business, in April this year. And our expertise really can be grouped around these 3 areas shown on the slide today. So firstly, climate, nature, and resources, very relevant for the topic at hand. We have deep expertise in GHG accounting, target setting, net zero strategies, and also on the risk and resilience side of things. And increasingly, we're working with clients on both climate and nature strategies at once. Then we also have significant, very practical experience when it comes to agriculture and landscapes. So for companies who have set the targets and understood their risk already and maybe identified specific supply chains or landscapes where they need to take action, this team is great at working with them, specifically to plan out that action and implement it on the ground, also to bring forward monitoring, reporting, and verification of that action to make sure the outcomes can be tracked. And finally, we're global leaders on deforestation and commodities. So we manage very large, complex programs to improve traceability in commodity supply chains, and we support on deforestation target setting and regulatory alignment. So today with me, I have Richard Sheane. I'll do very brief intros to him. He is a co-founder and director at 3Kill, over 20 years of experience advising businesses across a range of sectors on their sustainability strategies, and particular deep expertise on climate targets, GHG accounting, and decarbonisation. And his work really focuses on helping companies understand these emerging standards, like the one we're discussing today, as well as kind of building those practical action plans to align. And he has participated in technical working groups for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and also been a contributing author for the RAP Scope 3 protocol for food and drink. Then we have Emilien. He is strategy director at our Lens program and also head of client engagement at 3Keel. Additionally, he's a co-founder of the Carbon Accounting Alliance. That's a nonprofit with over 2,300 members across 75 countries, and really trying to solve the climate crisis from the carbon accounting perspective. And he previously held positions across carbon emissions management and supply chain transparency and carbon markets. So very relevant for the topic he's discussing today. And then finally, I'm a principal consultant team lead at 3Keel. I lead one of our main delivery teams working with clients on climate strategies and risk. And prior to 3Keel, I spent some time working with the Science Based Targets Initiative as well. So with that, I'll hand things over to Rich to get us started.
Great, thank you very much, Olwen. So yeah, I'm going to do a bit of context setting and introduction. So first of all, what is the net zero standard? Effectively, it's SBTi's foundational framework for target setting, implementation, and progress assessment. They take climate science and scenarios, they develop their methods and pathways for decarbonisation, and they translate that into the standard with a set of criteria. And sitting alongside that, they have sector-specific standards and guidance. They've got their target setting tool, which has had a big refresh as part of this process. They develop this validation requirements for going through the process, and also have information on claims and reporting. So it's kind of the central document that sets out the standard for target setting under their initiative, and that supports businesses on the whole journey from target setting through to developing the decarbonisation plans, transition plans, implementing, reporting, and then reviewing and going back into a new cycle of target setting. So it's really a foundational document within their ecosystem. It is worth noting that the criteria that are in other sector-specific standards, such as FLAG, still take precedence. So this is the net zero standard is a foundational document, but other sector-specific standards where they exist take precedence on those areas. So that's the basic introduction. So in terms of timelines for the version 2, so we had version 2 launched last month, so not long ago. They're going to be launching the validation resources, they say, in October of this year. So that's the documentation that will give information about how businesses use that standard to go through the SBTi's validation process to actually get the target set. They're saying validations against this new standard will be available from the beginning of February 27. Apologies, got the number wrong there. And then you can keep on using version 1, i.e. the version that's already out there, until January of next year, essentially. So for 2027, you could be setting, for most of it anyway, you could be setting a version 2 target or a version 1 target. It's completely up to you during that period. And we'll come back with a little bit more detail on how companies can transition from version 1 to version 2 later on. So if you've already got a target, what that might look like in practice. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of some of the basics. I think it is worth noting, because we might have a variety of different sizes of organizations on the call, that they have replaced their SME route, small and medium-sized enterprise route, with 2 different categorizations of companies. So this is quite an important thing to get your head around if you're kind of on the boundary between a large and a small business, because they have very different implications for your target setting approach. So category A, so this is larger businesses. So these are larger businesses globally, plus some companies that are a bit smaller but are in high income countries. So within the documentation, it kind of sets out the criteria for whether how you're considered category A or B. Category A, so if you're in any country globally and you have a net turnover of more than 450 million euros or over 1,000 FTEs, then you're a category A. If you are in a high income country and you meet one of the criteria below there, so your scope 1 and 2 emissions is over 10,000 tons, or you've got at least 2 or 3 of the other criteria there, then you are a category A company. And so if you go through that process, if you are a category A company, then the full requirements of the standard will apply. Generally speaking, this means that there's more assurance, more disclosure expectations, and scope 3 targets will be required for category A. If you're not category A, then you're category B. And yeah, it's a slightly less onerous process. There's a few criteria in the document as well. So just on guidance of, how do you come up with these figures? So you should use, if you're getting a target for a group, the consolidated group figures. You can use an average of the 2 most recent financial statements. And this kind of categorization is determined at the registration and validation. So if you're a growing business, you may change categories over the course of a target cycle, but you wouldn't go to the new category A until your next target setting cycle. So very high level, what's in the standard is quite useful to see kind of from a helicopter view. So it's got these 6 sections. I put in there the number of criteria in each section. So there's over 208 sub-criteria that will be relevant, all of which will be relevant to category A, and a significant chunk will be relevant to category B. And it goes across all the different process sort of stages of setting a target. So importantly, there's sections on board accountability, governance, and governance arrangements, climate transition planning as well, which we'll come on to. There's a section on base year assessment, which is a really foundational part of the target setting process, establishing a base year. So that's very much like it is at the moment, with a few evolutions. There's a section on target setting itself. So, what are the options for scope 1, 2, and 3? Interestingly, as Olwen alluded to, and we'll cover later on, there's a new section on target implementation, which is really talking setting out a framework by which businesses should target implementation actions, from direct action in your supply chain through to the use of market-based instruments or sector initiatives. Olwen will come into that in a little bit later. That section also contains a lot of criteria about, if you're participating in those sorts of schemes, what are the sorts of criteria should be adhered to. Then there's a section on reporting and assessing progress. And then finally, there's a section which is around an optional recognition program about ongoing emissions responsibility, which is what Emilien will cover. So the little stars and the underlines are what we're going to kind of focus on today. But as you can see, people think of SBTi as a target setting initiative. Well, that's part of it. Now it's a much more rounded standard. So stepping back just for a second, these are the general themes that we see in this new evolution. So first of all is assurance validation and the SBTi operating model. So it definitely introduces a lot more scrutiny, including third-party assurance of a variety of the metrics that go into a target setting process for category A companies. So this definitely will mean, if you're embarking on V2, more evidence, more data, more robust processes, and more scrutiny. The second theme is on transition planning and the shorter accountability cycles. So the standard is moving kind of, as I said before, beyond the sort of simple target submission, and then into kind of shorter cycles of 5-year periods. So where companies will need to demonstrate credible plans for the next cycle, and not just a kind of a longer term ambition. And also the base year will have to be the most recent year as well. So you can't use historic base years anymore under V2. You'll definitely need to use the most recent year as your base year. So it's a shorter cycle. I think the third theme is definitely around scope 3 target setting. So it's becoming more detailed. You're going to have to identify significant categories, think carefully about what needs to be in the boundary. There are some interesting exclusions, which I'll come on to in a bit later. And I think overall, this is going to increase the importance of good granular Scope 3 data, especially for Category A companies. I think the fourth theme is more differentiated target architecture. And so what I mean by that is that you'll have a separate Scope 1 and 2 targets. And for Scope 3, there are a much wider mix of options for target setting. So it is a bit more complex in terms of the number of targets that people are likely to have, but it is potentially better aligned to real-world decarbonisation levers. And I'm going to go into more detail on that after this section. I think the other theme, then the final theme, is around credible implementation, and this is probably the biggest conceptual shift. Olwen is going to go into this in a bit more detail, but really the implementation hierarchy asks companies to think carefully about what actions count, how direct those actions are, and when it's reasonable to use those wider activity or sector level interventions. So I think the overall take is that it's both more demanding and yet more practical in some ways. It definitely raises expectations around evidence, assurance, data, and accountability, but it also does give companies more flexible tools to reflect the realities of implementation, which is one of the main bits of feedback from the whole consultation processes. So I'd say the key message for V2 is that preparing for V2 is not just about recalculating your target, your percentage reduction. It is about getting ready for a more evidence-led, implementation-focused and assurance-ready approach to net zero more generally. And kind of to drill a little bit more into some notable kind of innovations. So interestingly, for Scope 1, they have this new asset decarbonisation plan option, which is really a new asset-based target option for capital stocks, such as factories, for example. So the idea is it means that you can plan abatement, retirement, or replacement of those assets and have a target that recognises that those emissions aren't likely to be a nice linear reduction, that across your estate you will have a refresh rate. So it's kind of trying to align asset management with decarbonisation planning, which seems very sensible. So on Scope 2, some interesting things there. For this one, the options are either going to be a low carbon electricity target or an absolute reduction target. Interestingly, electricity use projections are required to be disclosed, so looking forward the next 5 years. And also the discussion around renewable purchasing, hourly matching, that was in the original draft of this standard a requirement for Category A, but it's now optional, although they have a recognition scheme to enable recognition of people who are using hourly matching when they purchase green tariff regos or other instruments. As I've said, Scope 3 targets, which I'll dive into in more detail. Now the requirement is that you include any Scope 3 category that's over 5% of your total Scope 3. There are some interesting exclusions now that you can just exclude altogether. So for example, commuting, you can just say we're not doing it. And as I said, there's a much wider set of target approaches. Another interesting innovation is this emissions intensive activity concept. I think in the original draft, they had this as a means by which you would actually have to set targets against these, but now that's been slightly loosened. So now you just have to identify and quantify some specific energy intensive activities in your value chain. So for example, aluminium production, just as an example, they have an annex with a list of these activities. You need to disclose these as part of the process, and they are trying to encourage people to set targets that are aligned to addressing those, although it's not, you wouldn't have a formal target against them. Implementation hierarchy and criteria, I won't go into any more detail on that. And OER, obviously we've mentioned before. So these are kind of some of the notable innovations across this the new standard. So that's the kind of big picture themes side of things. Now we're going to dive into those 3 areas that we identified. And I'm up first with Scope 3 target setting options. So this is probably one of the main areas of innovation in the actual target setting chapter. So in terms of the process, there's kind of broadly 3 steps to it. first of all, you identify those significant categories. And I've got an example to show you later in a couple of slides on this. So anything over 5% needs to come into your target boundary. And as I mentioned, you can exclude optionally some scope 3 categories. So commuting and another example is downstream transport and distribution, if you have effectively zero influence over how a product is transported downstream. Once you've identified those significant categories, then you select your targets. So you can select one or a combination of different methods, and then you use the SBTi tool to calculate your target minimum ambition. So I've got a slide later on about their new beta web tool, which is a big improvement on the Excel tool that you may be used to. So in terms of those targets for scope 3, really those three options are, you can still have an overarching absolute reduction. So if you've got your two emissions, you've identified your key categories, you can just set a total absolute emissions reduction. Many of you will be already using those or aware of them. In the original draft, this wasn't an option, but they've brought that into the final version. So that's one. You can have an overarching supplier alignment target. So that is setting a target to enable to ensure a certain percentage of your suppliers are in transition or net zero by a set date, and I'll give an example of that in a second. So again, that will be familiar to some people potentially. It's not the most popular of target setting approaches at the moment, but it's still there, and it's been expanded actually. And then finally, which is the slightly more interesting approach, which was very much the core of that initial draft of this standard, is the category specific targets. And I'm going to go into more detail on that in a second. And there's a final optional step where you can, because it's quite a complex, especially if you take category 3, lots of different sub-targets, you can aggregate them into a single target for communications purposes. But we're not going to go into that today, but that is the final step of the process. So as I mentioned, the sort of supplier customer alignment targets are still very much there, and I think will become more popular. And they've actually expanded these alignment type targets out to offer more options. So for example, I've got here an example of a volume alignment target. And this is directly from the beta tool. I was having a play around as I was reading the standard. So in this example, the company intends to increase the share of purchased plastics by volume that is lower carbon to 70%, of which 10% is net zero aligned by 2030. So obviously they will need to define, and they said they will define what lower carbon means. There's a definition I've put here, but that will need a bit more working up. So you can see that a proportion of your target may be made up of these, alignment type targets. Just to then go into a little bit more detail on the different categories of reduction target for scope 3. So that overarching absolute reduction, as I said, that's just single absolute scope 3 reduction, linear contraction to residual emissions in 2050 or earlier. And that applies across all of your target boundary and is applicable to all sub-scope 3 categories. So for example, your target may be reduce absolute scope 3 emissions by 18% by 2030 from a 2025 year base year. So that might be your scope 3 target. Your overarching supplier alignment, the example there is your target may be increase the share of your tier 1 suppliers that are in transition or net zero aligned by 70% by 2030. So that may, and that is, so that's another option, an overarching one of those. And then finally was this category specific option, which I'm going to go into an example now. So if you're setting a category specific target for scope 3, I've come up with a bit of an example here using their beta tool. So in this example, we've got a business, it's not a very large one, but we're going to treat it like it's a category A, 2,300 tons of scope 3 emissions, and it's got a base year of 2025, going to target year 2030. First of all, you identify which categories contribute more than 5%. In this example, there's just 2. Purchase goods and upstream transport, so they become what goes into your target. Then you have to cover those emissions by a mixture of target types. So in this example, their company, about half of those emissions were flag commodities, half were plastics, or a quarter were plastics, purchased plastics, and the other were a mix of other goods and services. And then for transport, there's some heavy road freight and some aviation. So this is their kind of breakdown of their significant categories into activities. And then for each of those, they then have a target. So essentially your scope 3 becomes a mixture of different targets. Flag may be an absolute reduction. The plastics purchasing may be a volume alignment, as the example I showed before, etc. So this is how it becomes a bit more of a portfolio approach to target setting. The idea behind this is that they become more nuanced, the targets, rather than a rather blunt absolute reduction. They speak a little bit more to specific sectors and technologies. Great, I've rushed through that, but hopefully that was a good introduction to the scope 3, and over to you, Olwen, for the implementation hierarchy.
Great, very helpful. Thank you, Rich. Yeah, so I'm now going to turn to examine a new and very significant concept from this version 2 standard, the implementation hierarchy. And essentially, this hierarchy reflects the SBTi's move to a slightly more flexible view on how companies can make progress against their targets. So on the next slide there, Rich, I'll just show you the hierarchy itself. I think this the key message before diving into each tier here is that there is essentially an increased recognition of interventions that are going to sit outside your physical GHG inventory. So in the past, under version 1, when you set targets, the only way you could demonstrate progress against those targets was by taking an action that actually changed your physical GHG inventory. However, now the approach is that companies can take action at any one of these tiers, however, only when they've exhausted the ability to take action at the previous tier. And that needs to be documented. So it needs to be clearly disclosed what the constraint is that's preventing you taking action, say at tier 1, for you to then to move down and take action at tier 2 as well. So I'll run through each in turn and give a couple of examples. First one, yeah, tier 1 activity level. This is essentially fairly straightforward because it's those actions, interventions that directly target your own company's emissions that sit in your value chain that are counted in the kind of classic greenhouse gas protocol inventory approach. I guess an example here is you manage to make your processing more energy efficient. So you therefore have perhaps reduced your scope 1 emissions. But then you may hit a wall with how far you can go on reducing those emissions directly in your inventory. And rather than just giving up and not doing anything, the SBTi is trying to incentivize investment and action in a broader type of climate mitigation. So that could be projects or market-based instruments. And at the tier 2 level, that's within an activity pool. So this is probably a new term or concept for many on the call. But an activity pool is essentially the shared system that sits between the individual, within value chain physical inventory activity and then across the whole sector. So examples of that might be an electricity grid or logistics route or network, or a supply shed. So supply shed being a kind of group of producers, be they farmers or say factories, who are producing functionally equivalent products or commodities within usually a region, so usually a subnational level. So an example here could be, reducing fertilizer use in that supply shed, but it's without direct traceability. So you're not saying we're reducing fertilizer use exactly on the farms that we know then there's a physical supply through to us, but rather it's in a broader area and that will be having some impact, but it's harder to track. And then the final one, tier 3, is where you go out broader again to the sector level. So where you have those structural barriers that might even be preventing action at tier 2, you can take action at the sector level. So this could be, for example, purchasing a credit or a certificate, perhaps, for low carbon fertilizer in this instance. And there are quite a few guardrails in place around if you are taking these actions, the criteria that need to be met, which I'll speak to in a moment, but also, as I said, importantly, that you have demonstrated why you are taking action at that level as opposed to the previous level. Great. So if you go on to the next slide, Rich, thanks. This is just, I guess, a note almost taking a step back from the SBTi itself and just noting that this previous hierarchy is really in line with the concept of multi-ledger accounting that we've seen emerging over the last few years, with the view to better capture climate mitigation impact. And so we have seen the greenhouse gas protocol, for example, through the more recently land sector and removals standard, and then guidance talking about having a separate space in your GHG report where you report non-physical inventory impacts. And then there's the greenhouse gas protocol actions and market instrument working group that's considering how market-based instruments can be, I guess, implemented and given credit for, but again, sitting outside your physical inventory. So there's also a few other bodies like the TACT, the Task Force for Corporate Action Transparency, who actually have already produced guidance on this. So it's more of a watch this space. There's going to be plenty more coming around how multi-ledger accounting should work, but I would suggest you maybe read some of the draft guidance that's out there and just start to think about this new shift in how carbon accounting had previously been very much just physical inventory, and now it's broadening out. Thanks, Rich. So going back to the actual implementation hierarchy itself at the from the SBTi standard, and crucially these guardrails I mentioned that if you're taking action at tiers 2 and 3 need to be met. The SBTi have developed integrity criteria. And so these would apply, as I said, to any market-based instruments or projects you're implementing. There are many more than those that are on the slide. There are 7 headline criteria that apply to any type of intervention. And then there are 7 that are specifically for projects and 5 that are specifically for market-based instruments. But just in the interest of time, we've pulled out 4 notable ones to go through today, but I would recommend taking a look at the rest of the criteria in the standard itself. So before we'll go through, is firstly activity matching. So essentially, if you are looking to have an intervention at tier 2 or 3, it has to address the exact type of activity or product or ingredient that you are reporting in a GHG inventory. So it's quite different to say buying a carbon credit. In the past, it might have been for a completely different type of activity in a more kind of compensation basis. The second one is quantification. So you need to transparently and conservatively quantify the scale and outcomes associated with your action or intervention. Interesting part of this is using recognized methodologies. I think that's immediately going to prompt a lot of questions saying which methodologies, how are they recognized? And I guess the SBTi is therefore developing some criteria and processes around how they will recognize those other third-party existing frameworks and standards. So there isn't a reinvention of the wheel here the whole time. So I'd definitely keep coming in Q4 this year. I think they're calling it the interoperability framework or something similar. Then verifiability, so documentation. Rich has already pointed to this, evidence is becoming more and more important in this second version of the standard. And crucially here, the idea is that not just your GHG physical inventory might need to be audited or assured, but also anything you're using in the other 2 tiers. So a market-based instrument or a project could actually also need to be assured itself. Again, when you immediately think, okay, what would that assurance look like? How detailed does it need to be? The SBTi has an assurance framework coming out early next year. So we're hopeful that will give a bit more explanation as to what the expectations will be around third-party assurance of MBIs. And then finally, this one may seem really obvious, double counting prevention, but I guess it's just saying that it's, the onus is on a reporting company to ensure that any intervention you're taking isn't being double counted. So say, for example, you're funding some action within an activity pool, but actually someone else is buying the carbon credit for that. And therefore the action is being double counted. Just caution around the rules there of additionality and kind of stacking of action. Okay, so on to the next slide then. What I've done here is very similar to the first slide, but just tried to bring it to life a bit with more of a worked example. In this instance, a food manufacturer that we're saying is a category 2 company, and they're looking to reduce the impact or the emissions from purchased beef. And so what might they do? They would initially maybe look to reformulate their products so they could reduce the volumes of beef that are used, but then they might hit a limit with how much reformulation they can do. And so they document that constraint, which is also so I guess there's 2 constraints here. One, they might hit the wall with how much reformulation to do. But secondly, then they say, okay, let's try and take action to reduce the emissions intensity of the beef that we're procuring. But the constraint there is that with a concentrated beef supply, they don't have traceability back to farm level. So it's hard for them to implement that action and prove it within their physical inventory. So instead, they say, I'm going to move to tier 2 and take action at the activity pool level. So they fund a project to reduce methane emissions from the beef being produced, but across their whole supply shed. So not just on the exact farms they're procuring from, because they don't have that traceability. But again, perhaps they kind of reach a limit there and have to document the constraint that they're procuring lots of pasture-fed livestock, and so methane, say feed additives to inhibit methane, are more challenging to administer in their specific supply shed. And instead, or maybe additionally, they buy methane reduction feed additive carbon credits. So that's a kind of sector level, very much market-based intervention that sits at tier 3. But yeah, as I said, crucially through all of these, you just need to be documenting the constraints. Conscious of time, I'm going to fly through my final slide here, which is just, well, how is all of this going to be assessed? And really, there's a lot of ambiguity remaining here. But one important new concept is there's an end of cycle target progress assessment that you as a company are going to need to fill in. And for category A companies, that actual assessment is going to need to be third-party assured. And it will likely be within that assessment that you're going to disclose the activities or the actions you're taking at each of those activity levels, each of those 3 tiers. Really interestingly, there's this new concept of best effort basis. So if you can clearly demonstrate at that stage that levers in your control or influence have been applied and you've taken good actions to overcome any existing barriers, you will then be allowed to go to your next target cycle. But there is still, as I said, some uncertainty of what this will look like in practice, and we expect that the assurance framework and claims system that are both due for release early next year will bring a bit more clarity. So over to you, Emilien.
Amazing. Thanks, Olwen, and thank you for your questions. Keep them coming. We will answer all of them live at the end. I started to answer some of them, but I think they're really worth the conversation. So ongoing emissions responsibility, replacing the very exciting beyond value chain mitigation, BVCM. So we've gone from 4 letters to 3 letters of an acronym, which I think is a major improvement. But jokes aside, OER, is while BVCM was really about making the business case for doing things outside of your value chain, for example, buying carbon credits, and really encouraging business to do so, there was really no prescription to do so before basically your net zero year, where you would have to buy carbon removals. And it didn't provide any recognition to businesses, really any formal recognition for doing so either. It was deferring to other organizations like the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, and kind of deferring any responsibility as an organization for that. And I think that was a real shame. And I think they recognized that in a way, because it wasn't really encouraging businesses to go above and beyond their physical inventory, their scope 1 to 3, and fundamentally taking responsibility for those emissions all the while reducing them, which is really key. BVCM introduced a number of different ways businesses could go about this. They called them, other very cool terms like ton for ton, money for money. That's now been simplified a little bit, and I'll go through what those mean in a second. So what is the ongoing emissions responsibility? I spent a lot of time thinking about how to visualize this a little bit, because it does get a little bit complex. But in simple terms, there's an optional and there's a mandatory segment to it. So anyone setting a net zero target, of course, you don't have to set a net zero target. You could just set a reduction target. But for anyone setting a net zero target, really the first element is this recognition program, which kickstarts as of today and is kind of ongoing until you kind of reach your net zero year. They don't make it super clear, but it kind of sort of goes alongside the mandatory section. And I'll explain what the recognition program covers in a sec. In terms of the mandatory section, it's now essentially prescribing that you buy carbon removals of about 1% of your emissions or more from 2035. And those should rise linearly, and I'll show what that looks like, an example, to about 100%, or not about, to exactly 100% of your remaining or residual emissions by your net zero target year, which could be 2050, it could be 2040, depending on how ambitious you are. So it's really exciting. It's pretty game-changing, I think, for what it will mean, particularly for the carbon removal markets. And I hope it'll encourage companies to really engage with this earlier rather than later, which was kind of the case before. One other thing to mention is that now this is covering all scopes 1 to 3, including your scope 2. So you can't look at your market-based scope 2 for the calculation of those emissions. You have to use your location-based. So in other words, you can't deduct the renewable energy credits when you're making those maths. And the final thing, which is also quite exciting, is you can now share your scope 3 responsibility with someone else. So in other words, if a supplier has already bought some carbon credits or some other kind of climate activity, and that scope 3 is recognized in your inventory, then effectively you don't have to contribute for that percentage as well. So you can kind of share responsibility with customers and suppliers as long as you're reporting this in a consistent way to the SBTi. Couple of definitions worth knowing. So ton for ton, what do we mean here? They actually don't use the term ton for ton in the new standard, but I find it a good shorthand for basically matching all of the emissions you're emitting with an equivalent amount of verified mitigation outcomes. The second is a contribution budget. So basically setting an internal carbon price, getting a budget, and then spending that budget on climate action. They've introduced this new term called verified mitigation outcomes, or VMOs. Effectively, this is kind of, for all intents and purposes, a carbon credit, or something very much like a carbon credit that has all of the same criteria. So it's a bit confusing why they've not gone for simple terms that we might recognize, but I think they wanted to be more inclusive in what could constitute a suitable verified mitigation outcomes. And if you did Latin at school, you'll be very excited to apply that knowledge to this term called ex post and ex ante. Ex post basically means stuff that's happened in the past, and ex ante, stuff that's going to happen in the future. So basically, when you're buying a verified mitigation outcomes, that reduction or that removal of carbon must have happened already, rather than something that you're buying for the future. What's really exciting is now formally recognizing things outside of the whole kind of verified mitigation space. So anything like R&D, adaptation funding, resilience, loss and damage, all of these things are now included, and they've got a whole set of criteria that need to abide by. But fundamentally, you can invest in other things than perhaps the carbon market. And finally, carbon dioxide removal, or CDR for short. Really, they talk about short-lived and long-lived. A simple way to sort of think about that is in terms of how long this carbon will be stored. There isn't actually a definition of the number of years. 100 years is used in the ISO standard, but it's not actually defined in the SBTi standard. Some say, durable removal is actually 1,000 years plus. So, you kind of need to pick your duration here and just be consistent and transparent about it. Okay, so in terms of the ambition levels and what is actually involved in this kind of pre-2035 recognition program. So there's 3 main levels: engaged, advanced, and leadership. The engaged level is hopefully really accessible to companies. The SBTi has sort of set some pretty loose guidance here. You need to cover at least kind of 1% of your scope 1 to 3 emissions. But you can either kind of match that on a ton for ton basis, so buy an equivalent amount of tons to 1% of your emissions, or you can apply this contribution budget with an internal carbon price. But they haven't actually defined the minimum floor for this internal carbon price. So literally whatever you can afford to spend should and will be recognized under this program, as long as you justify it and explain why you've chosen those things. They do recommend $20 as the sort of minimum carbon price, which is well below what the science is saying of what an actual carbon price should be, which is much higher. We're talking sort of hundreds of dollars, depending on the source that you use. So really, you should use $20, but you don't have to. And you can either go and buy verified mitigation outcomes, in other words, carbon credits, or you can invest in this other climate action. And that is the same for all of the levels, aside from the leadership level, which requires you to buy an equivalent amount of verified mitigation outcomes for your emissions before you go and invest any remaining budget for other climate action if you're a category A company. So if you're still following me, let's move on to what happens at 2030. So at year 2030, it is now mandatory for all companies to buy carbon removal credits, or carbon dioxide removal, CDR. The contribution approach is not eligible, so it has to be on a ton for ton basis. So you have to buy an equivalent amount of tons based on the coverage of emissions. And they really want long-lived emissions, which are usually fossil emissions, and I'll cover what those are in a bit as well, of at least 10% of the emissions that are covered to be matched with long-lived removals, increasing linearly until the year 2050. So there's a real concept of short-lived and matches short-lived, or long-lived matches long-lived. You can also buy long-lived removals for the entirety. That's fine, but there really is a push for those durable carbon removals. Think direct air capture, and I'll share some other examples in a second. And then at the net zero target, 100% of the residual emissions, in other words, the emissions that are left, should be taken on. Okay, moving on. Here's an example, just to bring it to life a little bit, because that's probably a little bit overwhelming. Let's say you're a food manufacturer, about 500 mil turnover. You've got emissions about 400K or 400,000 tons. And most of that's in scope 3, which is pretty consistent for all people in the food industry, whether you're a grocery retailer or a food manufacturer. This is kind of what you would look like in terms of budgets for the different sections. So there is a big jump from the engaged to advanced if you're using the kind of internal carbon price way to make that budget. And then the leadership level really looks, that's about 6% of turnover. So that would be really, really hard for anyone, I think, in the kind of food or physical value chain space. I think from our perspective, probably services companies or tech companies that have high profitability, but actually low intensity of carbon emissions would likely opt for the kind of leadership option. At this stage, most companies will probably go for engaged and advanced, and that's probably what you need to look at if you're in the kind of food or physical value chain environment. This is what it looks like visually. So if you were to assume emissions to have reduced from that 400K to 270 in 2035, actually the requirement to buy carbon removals would be quite small. It's about 2,700 tons, which wouldn't be too hard to do. But of course, the supply of those carbon removal credits needs to exist in 2030. And right now we know the market is still very nascent. So a lot of companies will have to invest early doors to actually make that happen by that date, because there probably won't be any supply left for anyone who wants to buy on the spot, hoping that everyone's gone and removed carbon for them by the time they get there. So if you look at like the linear sort of progression of those emissions on a percentage level, actually what that means is that you will be increasing the amounts of carbon removal that you need to buy in a slightly higher and faster fashion than your emissions reduce, because it's done on a percentage of the emissions. And so they will cap out or peak out at sort of 2046, and then progressively reduce as your emissions reduce. Obviously, your emissions might not reduce in such a nice, clean line. There'll be ups and downs, but that gives you a bit of an idea of what it should look like. And finally, what does it look like in this sort of, infamous net zero year that we should all hopefully be aiming for? Well, your long-lived emissions, so fossil CO2, things from maybe your freight or processing, anything like burning fossil fuels, essentially, or things like fertilizer, NO2 or nitrous oxide, those will be considered long-lived emissions, and therefore you need to buy long-lived carbon removal credits to match those. Things like DAX, BECS, or enhanced rock weathering, anything that's considered really more than 100 years or potentially more than 100 years if your definition goes to that. And then all of your short-lived and biogenic emissions are typically short-lived, will be able to be matched with things like planting trees, forestation, soil organic carbon, etc., etc. We don't really know exactly where the guidance will lie on what constitutes suitable short-lived removals within the value chain versus outside of the value chain, but there should be an expectation that if you have removals in the adjacent and or within specifically the inventory, the definitions and system boundaries, that you should be able to count those towards your net zero target. Okay, let's wrap up and go to questions. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks. Sorry, just coming off mute. Actually, I've got some practical implications first. And so what we might do is go through this a little bit quicker than expected. We're sharing the slides after. So yeah, because we would like to get to some questions. So I'm not going to go through these now. I would definitely flag there's some great resources that SBTi put together. I've flagged the ones in orange when you get the slides, which are really if you want to kind of get a feel for the standard. And then if you're into the planning mode, then there's a whole bunch of resources, documents. So these are all document names. So do take a look at that, and also keep an eye out for more guidance coming out in the coming months. And the tool I mentioned before, you can go online, there's a beta tool, you can actually put in your emissions and see what a target might look like, which is quite cool. Not all the options are there yet, but it gives you a really practical kind of idea of what it looks like. And then there are a few no regrets actions that you can definitely take now, regardless of where you're at. I think what we might do is skip to the Q&A rather than do the quick poll now, because I think there's a few questions. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first questions that came in. So how does the change in this SBTi standard affect large businesses who do not have SBTi targets set, but are suppliers to businesses who do have SBTi targets? So what do the suppliers need to do?
I would say that, I guess, if your customers go down the route of the supplier alignment targets, i.e., X% of their suppliers by emissions are in transition or are net zero by a certain date, then I guess there'll be a push to get targets to support their target setting. So I guess, if you don't have a target and you don't have any intention to other than that, then I guess that's one obvious thing. I don't know, Olwen or Emilien.
Yeah, I would say that's likely the case. And if they don't go down that route, they will likely be asking you to reduce your emissions and evidence
Yeah,
that. But from an SBTi like target setting formal perspective, there wouldn't be any direct impact on you.
Amazing. Thanks, Olwen. Second question, Richard, is what does the V2 say about biogenic CO2? Specifically, do companies have to reduce their biogenic scope 1 emissions as well, or do they only need to be reported alongside without influence on the target itself?
Good question. I mean, they still defer to GHG protocol on their accounting. So the land sector removals guidance have introduced a few more interesting guardrails for when you can continue to put your biogenic CO2 scope 1 outside of scopes, as it were. I would look at that. However, if you meet those criteria, which I think is still likely, then they still sit outside of scope 1. So really, the physical inventory is scope 1. So I'd say that they wouldn't be coming into. So if you're burning biofuels in trucks, for example, those will still be outside of the target, scope 1 target. Yeah. But I would keep look at the land sector removals guidance requirements for biogenic CO2 accounting and the criteria.
Great, thanks, Richard. Next question is, are the scope 3 exclusions assuming the excluded areas are less than 5%?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't remember reading.
Not. Yeah, sorry to jump in. Yeah. There's a few categories where you can exclude them even if they, like, irrespective of whether they fall into that significance bucket. Yeah. So they are fuel and energy related activities, as long as that's already covered in scope 1 and 2, employee commuting. For some of the upstream least acids or downstream T&D, it's just where you can demonstrate that the company doesn't have contractual or other means to influence. So it's basically a little bit nuanced. It's not a kind of free for all you can exclude, I think, other than employee commuting. For the others, it's like, as long as you can demonstrate there's a very valid reason to exclude, irrespective of its 5% threshold, they can be excluded.
Great. Got a question here from Karen. Can you set an absolute emissions reduction target and a supplier target and a category specific target? Or can you use those different approaches for different parts of your scope 3 inventory?
So basically you have to, you either have an overarching absolute or an overarching supplier alignment, or you go down the category specific. And within the category specific, that's where you could have that mixture of an absolute reduction for your flag emissions, maybe absolute reduction for your other spend, but then an intensity target for your air freighted transport. And then, so that was the example. So it's kind of like the decision tree would be, is it an overarching absolute, overarching supplier, or are you into this kind of smorgasbord of targets?
Which is probably the most beneficial, but also the most work in terms of the target.
Yeah, I mean, because like we said before, you got to get into the assurance and verification of all those indicators. You've got to then get into the space of, if you're using for one of those intensity metrics, a supply shed or a sector certificate, does it meet the criteria? So it does become a lot more complicated. However, the co-benefit is it is a lot more options for you to do stuff rather than just trying to have the one lever of an absolute tonnage reduction.
Great. Does a category A company have to set a net zero target, or can one still just set the near-term target? Richard or
happy to chime in here. Essentially, you can just set near-term targets. The only exception there is on scope 1, you need, if you use particular methods, so the scope 1 intensity or asset transition methods, then for your near term, then you also have to set long-term targets. But if you use scope 1 absolute reduction targets, it's just a recommendation to set long-term, and you don't have to set long-term for the other scopes, which I think was a slightly controversial outcome of this standard from listening to some feedback, because it is called the net zero standard. But I think what the SBTi is likely to do is in the kind of claims guidance is make it really clear you can't claim to have a net zero target or claim to be net zero if you're just working on your near-term cycles.
I guess the rationale is that sort of implicit in all of the near-term targets are you are hitting net zero by 2050 or earlier, and the tool says as such. So it's almost like it's kind of implicit in it. But yeah, we as at the moment, you wouldn't have a specific target for scope 3 for net zero. Cool.
Great. I'm going to skip a few questions that were partially answered already. What are the guidelines around excluding scope 3 categories from a target? Do they have to be below a certain threshold? You mentioned this might be due to lack of control, downstream transport, only a selection of categories to be excluded, which would make, for example, the purchase goods and services not possible to be excluded.
Yeah, it's either it falls under one of the allowed exclusions, so commuting, or it's less than 5% of your total scope 3, you can exclude it. But anything else you need to pull within your target boundary, which is at the moment for scope 3, it's 67% of your scope 3 need to fall within the target boundary, which meant people would kind of cobble together a few different categories, maybe commuting, business travel, purchase goods. Now it's kind of more at a category level. The decision is a yes or no.
That's very clear. Thank you. We have a question here from Karen. On page 37 of the standards, it states, when scope 3 activities are covered by targets set through applicable SBTi sector standards, including for the flag, companies are not required to set scope 3 targets for those same activities under the corporate net zero standard. Is the expectation that food and drink businesses will still have flag targets? How does the flag interlink with the net zero piece?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we are expecting, the flag sector standards to be updated in the coming years. However, for now, if you were going through a new validation, effectively, as I understand it, the ag part of your target, your flag target, would just stay as is, and then, or at least the the quantified target, you would still need to use the wider. If you're going through a new target validation process, you'd still need to use the version 2 as the kind of foundation for target setting, and the target options would be for those non-flag elements of these new the new target setting options. So, but any sort of flag method, you would then defer to the flag guidance as it stands at the time. And so if that still is version 1, then you just similarly you'd have similar targets basically. But yeah, that's likely to. I'm imagining a lot of the sector standards are going to evolve and become more aligned into the sort of way of target setting now for the core standard. But yeah, I'm not sure that I explained that very well.
Thanks, Rich. No, I think that was clear. Great. There's a question here that I'll answer. How does scope 3 use of carbon credits, brackets market-based tier, link or not link to the use of credits in OER? If activity is aligned, can credits be used for scope 3 reductions if hierarchy constraints are met? So yeah, this is it's a good question. Effectively, what the standards are saying is that any kind of sort of carbon credit, as we understand it right now, would sit in the ongoing emissions responsibility section, so it would not count towards your scope 1 to 3 inventory. However, they're not specific about what market-based instruments will be allowed for Scope 3 right now. And there are obviously activities or projects that could be one or could be the other. Like, for example, reducing, applying some biofertilizers in the global south with a bunch of smallholder farmers. This could potentially be a carbon credit issuing project if that's the way that they decide to set themselves up. It could also be issuing some sort of market-based instrument called the low carbon fertilizer, EAC, for example, which people could then purchase, and that would be somewhat linked to their value chain, but not with sort of perfect traceability to the end farm. So essentially, there will be a definition based on, there will be a decision based for the projects that will have to decide which way they go. And some of these may filter into Scope 3. They will never affect the physical inventory, but they will potentially be able to be reported in this kind of market-based statement, which we're now seeing the emergence of in the GHG protocol, etc. I realize we are over time by 1 minute. However, there's a lot of really interesting questions here, and there's still a lot of people on the call. So we're going to go and cover a few more for the next 10. So feel free to stick around if you want to go and cover more of this really interesting stuff. Okay, next question. I heard about engagement targets. Is it possible that for an upstream Scope 3 emissions, it's possible to set only supplier engagement target, where it's only about having suppliers to set SBTi targets? Does this mean I would not have to reduce emissions as long as my suppliers do the work for me?
Yes, so I'm trying to remember. So basically for Scope 3, they go through each of the categories. They have an explicit list of what target setting options are available. And I think from memory, there is an alignment option for every target. So I guess for your upstream, I think I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Olwen, can you remember?
I mean, I think essentially the answer is yes, but I think the question is, I wouldn't have to reduce my emissions. I don't think that part of the question would necessarily hold, because your emissions, your Scope 3 upstream emissions would be reducing, and that needs to be evidence to show they're reducing for this to be accepted. So the slide that Rich put up where he had done a kind of mock alignment graph for the supplier, or well, in that instance it was volume alignment, but if it was supplier alignment, you have to have that the entity, so the supplier in this instance is either in transition or a net zero aligned entity. So your supplier needs to evidence that, which will be reducing your Scope 3 emissions. But yes, I think if your question is, it's not going to be mandatory to set an absolute Scope 3 target on your upstream portion of emissions. Does that ring true for you as well, Rich?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Subject to kind of looking through each of the categories, I think there is that option for upstream, which is, I think, that is possible at the moment. So it's kind of a continuation of that type of approach.
But I'd say my guess is at the moment the amount of evidence you have to provide isn't that strong. And so I actually say it's probably going to become a bit more onerous as to evidencing that your suppliers are aligned.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
Great. Moving on to the next question. Bit confused by removal CDR element of the ongoing emissions responsibility guidance and avoidance reduction activities being permitted in the VMO or verified mitigation outcomes element. Can you explain what's permitted pre and post 20? Well, I imagine that's 2035, and if avoidance and reduction credits can be used. So effectively, verified mitigation outcomes covers things in a very broad sense. It could be avoidance, it could be reduction, or it could be removals. It could be any kind of activities that are doing any of those three elements. It doesn't even have to be carbon credit. That's why they've sort of changed the word, but it needs to be basically almost the same criteria as you would expect from a carbon credit. So for simplicity, let's just say it does. In terms of 2035, only carbon removals will be accepted as part of the mandatory section of the guidance. However, you can still choose to invest in reduction and avoidance credits above the mandatory requirement and still be recognized as part of this recognition program, which I presume will carry on beyond 2035, but who knows what decisions will be made by then. So hopefully that clarifies things a little bit, but the removals piece can already be used as part of the recognition program from today. You don't have to wait till 2035 to get some of that benefit if that's what you want to do. Okay, can you outline the difference between purchasing REGOs or renewable energy certificates and how they're accounted compared to OER? I'm happy to answer that as well. Basically, your renewable energy credits or REGOs are for scope 2. And that's where they'll sit. So they sit within your within your kind of GHG inventory somewhat, although they will be in a market-based segment, not in the physical inventory. You'll still be expected to report on your physical inventory of your location-based electricity carbon factors, emission factors. You may also use RECs or REGOs in your scope 3 on behalf of your suppliers. A lot of businesses have already been doing this, like Mars, for example, where they're buying RECs on behalf of their suppliers, where the suppliers are not necessarily doing so themselves. And so that could potentially count towards your scope 3 targets if you portion them out to the electricity component of your, let's say, purchase goods and services. So with a bit of accounting, you could potentially count that in your inventory as well. So yeah, essentially those are that. There are, I guess, places where it might sit outside of your inventory. For example, if you're investing in a renewable energy project in India that has no connection to your value chain, that would be more of a carbon credit scheme, and therefore, or it doesn't have to be, but that would sit outside of your scope 1 to 3 reporting. Okay, there's a question here, maybe for Olwen. Can you tell us more about book and claim and the use of SAF scope certificates, so Sustainable Aviation Fuel? Gosh, so many acronyms.
Yeah. Well, so book and claim, the SBTi does mention this a bit in their standard, but essentially this is a form of a kind of chain of custody model or lack thereof, where you don't have traceability at all in any way connecting you to the purchase of the instrument. And so it would definitely be falling within that third tier of activity in the implementation hierarchy. And so when it comes to SAF, if the certificates, that would be actually a great example, because you saw the third tier is sector level actions, right? But they can be market based. And so aviation is the sector. You buy SAF certificates that will fall within that specific tier, and you just need to make sure that the certificates are meeting the integrity criteria outlined in the standard. So there's, as I said, the 7 kind of headline criteria, and then there are 5 further specific for market-based instruments, which SAF certificates would be considered. So as long as they meet those, you could use them in that third tier. And then as part of your target assessment, when you're giving all of the evidence, both your physical inventory and then other actions you've taken, you would note that you purchase these certificates and, give all the documentation evidence and ideally have that assured.
Fantastic. Thanks, Olwen. I think we'll answer maybe 3 more questions, and then we'll make sure to give answers in writing for the rest. Just going through the next one. Will afforestation short-lived only be permitted as certified offsets, or will there be a permitted measurable way to inset? It's a very good question with no clear answer, I think, at this stage. They certainly are valid as of now under the ongoing emissions responsibility guidance. You can, put those carbon credits from afforestation projects into that reporting and get recognition for them. That's for sure. In terms of if they fit within your value chain system boundaries, that's, I guess, a question maybe more for the kind of flag guidance and how that's emerging, or maybe it's more of the GHG protocol LSRS guidance and what's going to be permitted. I think that's still not 100% decided on in terms of its proximate lands, what percentage of proximate lands, what's considered proximate or adjacent, because obviously forests are very rarely part of your inventory directly unless you're growing something underneath some trees, which I think some businesses do, maybe with some agroforestry, but very few who could say that clearly. So I don't know, Richard, if there's anything else you can add to that.
Yeah, no, that was my thought as well. I think that, outside of the OER, if it's about your value chain, then that would be a feature of the flag guidance, whether, and it might be that, as part of a flag reboot and alignment to this, that there are some sector level afforestation schemes which could kind of enable you to be shown to be taking action in the sector on flag. But so I just keep an eye on updates to that sector standard in the coming months.
Great, thanks, Rich. I'm going to put it to Olwen and Richard if there's any other questions you've seen that you really want to answer. Otherwise, I'll pick for you. I just want to give an opportunity since we only have one more.
I haven't actually been looking. I've been
okay, fine. Focusing on the answers.
I think there's
Olwen.
two questions that are both similar about like what specific standards are expected to come up in those in the kind of interoperability framework. And honestly, we don't know yet. I mean, I think we have a question here about ones that will come up at the activity pool level. Are they going to be industry specific? I mean, things like existing certificate schemes, say for particular commodities, if there's a well-established green steel certificate framework in place that's deemed to be high enough integrity, what we're imagining is the SBTi might kind of green light that. But it remains to be seen exactly what level that will sit at. And I'd imagine it won't just be one level. Like I think some might be quite granular detail down to that example, which is, you know, even a product rather than just a whole sector. And then in other instances, it might be pointing to more global frameworks or guidance. So yeah, not clear yet. And I think it will be a watch this space answer.
Yeah, I imagine that there'll probably be a route by which, you know, because they can't greenlight everything. There will be, you know, you'd either have to show that the project or whatever meets their criteria, integrity criteria, or yeah, they've got another track whereby if you're an initiative, you can get it, as Olwen said, kind of validated by them in advance almost. So so they'll be promoting themselves as SBTi validated market program or whatever in the future. So yeah.
Fantastic. Do we want to do one more? Or should we close it here? Go on, let's do one more.
I don't mind.
There's one question here from John. One of the target options under V2 is supplier alignment. Do you see any risk that supplier alignment targets become the dominant approach because they are comparatively easier to set and track than commodity? I imagine that's category or absolute reduction targets. If so, how can the sector ensure flexibility doesn't come at the expense of real reductions?
Well, I mean, I guess the counter argument to that is it's already been quite an easy option for companies, but for whatever reason, it hasn't been that popular. At least in the proportion of scope 3 targets under V1 that have been the supplier alignment is a very small proportion of the total that we've helped clients with. So that may not be representative, but I suspect they will become a bit more popular, but. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Olwen, if you have any thoughts.
I think a big barrier to their execution is when you have a changing supplier base and the tracking of that and like how to kind of manage it operationally. So it would be interesting to see what the SBTi ask for from an evidence perspective to show that your supplier is like net zero or in transition aligned entity. And that might decide if that is kind of easier to gather and monitor on an ongoing basis from a shifting supply base, then perhaps they'll become more popular, but I'd say it will continue to be a slight barrier. Oh, you're on mute, Emilien.
Well, just going to say that. I think that's all we have time for today. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining in. Thank you for all of your fantastic questions. There's still loads that we haven't covered, but we will attempt to make sure that we answer them and send them across so that everyone can benefit from the answers. We'll share the recording and the slides thereafter as well, and I'll hand over to Rich to close off.
Great. Well, yeah, nothing more to say really, other than thanks for coming. Yeah, if you need any help from us on any of these topics, the door is always open, and yeah, have a good afternoon.